Dismantling Global Hindutva screams the homepage of a website by the same name. This is the portal set up for a 3-day online global conference, which the organizers claim is aimed at exploring the consolidation of Hindu supremacist ideology in India and elsewhere. The organizers claim that this event, that is going to feature Indian academics, journalists and activists, is being supported by a host of North American universities. The seminar has evoked widespread condemnation, with critics alleging that the label of Hindutva is being used as a smokescreen for overt Hinduphobia. The question is this an initiative against bigotry or just blatant propaganda against Hindutva ideology?
You're watching the News Hour at 10, debate number 1 on Times Now, Super Prime Time.
So given the backdrop of this Dismantling Hindutva conference, there are a lot of voices that are now rising from across the world, particularly from the students community, from the academic community in the United States as well. People who are studying there and are seeing the fallout, or rather this discussion firsthand and in their neighborhood. 5 such people are actually joining us now. We have Arnav Kejriwal, he's the president of the Hindu Students' Council; Rashmi Samant, graduate and former president, University of Oxford, London; Parth Parihar, postdoctoral fellow at the Wallace Institute of Political Economy at the University of Rochester; Naisargi Jaiswal, graduate student at the Texas State University; and Prasiddha Sudhakar, senior at Rutgers University. I want to start by asking you first, Arnav, what do you make of this conference itself, and how does it impact you? Because I saw a few statements where people in the United States, students in the United States, Hindu students in the United States said, we are going to be victims of hate thanks to this conference. How's that?
So first of all, thank you for having me. Just to give a little bit of background, I'm the president of Hindu Students' Council, which is the largest Hindu organization for students and youth across North America. And we've existed since 1990 to provide a safe space to Hindu students that want to organize activities on campus and have a community for celebrations like Diwali, for Holi, for Garba, for discussions about being Hindu, etc. So over the past 15, 20 years, Hindu students have seen a tremendous rise in Hinduphobia on campus in terms of misunderstandings of what it means to be a Hindu student or misunderstandings of what our traditions represent. So naturally, a lot of times, for instance, we've had chapters that run into situations where their local brewery might put Ganesh on a beer bottle, right? So they'll bring that up with the brewery, or they'll notice that there's some kind of issue in a textbook and they'll bring that up with the teacher out of concern. Now, the problem is that this, a lot of times by scholars in the South Asian fields, has been brought into this quote unquote Hindutva narrative. And so this Global Hindutva conference is an attempt to kind of paint students in America and in any kind of Western country as Hindutva simply for speaking up for the Hindu community and issues that affect them. So this is naturally a big concern to students and the whole community in the US because, and as my friend Parth is going to say in a few minutes, I'm sure, this is kind of an issue where as soon as you say something about being a Hindu American or being a Hindu Canadian or a Hindu in the UK, you get painted as right-wing, as fascist, as Hindutva, as BJP, which ends up silencing a lot of students. So the reaction is quite visceral in the US because a lot of students and community members feel like they're being silenced. They're not going to be able to speak, and a lot of their, peers that are well-intentioned are starting to question their motives if this Hindutva conference actually has kind of any fold, right? So that's kind of a quick answer to that, Padmaji.
Parth, again, I want to repeat that question. How is people holding a conference about Hindutva affecting you as a Hindu student? Because the distinction being made is that Hinduism is the religion, Hindutva is the political assertion by using the Hindu identity. And that is also, anti-Muslim, it is fascist, etc.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Padmaja, so thanks for that. So I guess what I would say is that they make this claim that they're making a distinction between Hindutva and Hinduism. So it's really important to look at the claims that the conference is making. And so there are many, many things that the conference says that are objectionable, but I'll just focus on three main things. So the first thing that they say is that Hinduphobia doesn't exist. So what this means practically for a student is that if they face any type of bias at the university or even in their daily lives, it makes them very difficult for them to be able to approach the administration and be able to actually convince them that they're actually facing this discrimination, which is recognized as a valid form of anti-religious discrimination. Right. Recently, Oxford University, where Rashmi studies, they commissioned a study through the 1928 Institute, which found that 80% of British Indians experienced discrimination on the basis of their Indian origin. And most importantly, the most prevalent form of that discrimination was itself Hinduphobia. So, all of our experiences as lived Hindus in the West, our experience is that Hinduphobia is a very real thing.
Give me an
and yet
example,
these people,
because people are still willing to accept that there's discrimination on the basis of your Indian identity, but where do you draw the line that this is not based on your Indian heritage, but specifically about you being a Hindu student? Give me an example.
Yeah, so I'll give you two examples. So one is in 2016, I visited a cow sanctuary, a Gaushala here in the US. And the reason why I visited that cow sanctuary was just a few days earlier, a group of people in eastern Pennsylvania had taken it upon themselves to put a severed cow's head on the doorstep of this ISKCON Krishna devotee who was running this Gaushala. And they did that specifically to intimidate that person into moving away from that place, because they knew that the cow had a special place for him within his religious tradition. So this is a clear example of out and out Hinduphobia that's perpetuated by the right wing in the US sometimes. On the other hand, you have people who call, from the left, who call Hindus all sorts of names. So just to give one example, on Facebook in 2020, I was called a Nazi for recognizing Hindu persecution in Kashmir and in Delhi, in the Delhi riots. As a result of that, my parents' car was put on social media with the license plate so that people could identify it. I was called a cow piss drinker, and a professor from Cambridge University actually liked that comment and led in many ways this charge against me. So you can see, just for speaking up for Hindu people and for documenting the religious persecution that has happened historically, Hindu people get labeled. This has nothing to do with BJP or RSS or anything. And just one last thing, Padmaja, is that, when American citizens are labeled in this way, that they are somehow beholden to a foreign power, our country has a very dangerous history with that, with Japanese Americans, Catholic Americans, and so many other groups.
Rashmi, what about you? You, of course, have been in the news a lot, but why would you say that this was done specifically because of Hinduphobia?
Well, I think adding on to what Arnav and Parth have said, I experienced pretty much the same thing in a different way. For the duration that I was president, there were posts made by faculty members at the university speaking very elaborately about how they enjoy breaking idols, Saraswati Murtis, so on and so forth, and then criticize the fact that my parents, they're devotees of Sri Ram, pulling pictures, all sorts of pictures from their profiles and making nasty comments about their religion. And it was only about their religious identity and nothing to do with their nationality or political preferences. But when there was a lot of criticism coming their way, saying that this is not all right, this is discrimination, it's also racism in many ways. So when all of that happened, the faculty member just took refuge under the word Hindutva, saying, oh, I'm just criticizing the Indian government. How are you criticizing the Indian government by making elaborate posts about enjoying breaking Saraswati Murtis, by doxing a student who's also the union president?
Why would a professor talk about breaking Murtis? What was the context of that conversation or that comment?
I don't know, to be very honest. I think the only context I can think of is Hinduphobia, because I haven't interacted with this particular faculty. I'm a
Was there
STEM
any action
student.
taken?
Yes, there have been a lot of investigations. There has been an investigation into the issue, and I'm very satisfied with whatever result that's been the outcome of it.
Prasada, what are your specific problems with this conference? Because in academia, there's always space for a conversation. Everything can be discussed. But why are people calling out a conference where one side is presenting their views as Hinduphobic and potentially as something that could lead to a backlash?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think it's really important to look at what kind of resources is this conference sharing. So when we look at it, like Parth said already, they repeatedly say that Hinduphobia isn't real. Hinduphobia is just used as a tool to silence criticism of the Indian government. And again, I don't think any Hindu student across the US, UK, or Canada is offended if someone says something about Modi or any Indian political party. But when people are offended is when deliberately Hindu sacred symbols are desecrated to resemble the Nazis, to draw a parallel between Hindus and Nazis. And we've seen this happen a lot recently, where an Om symbol was literally desecrated to look like the Nazi flag. That's one example. And the second one is they completely deny Hindu persecution, and they do this very strategically. So they're trying to say that Hindu persecution has never happened, Hinduphobia isn't real, and this is a very deliberate tactic to basically create a proximity between Hindus and white people to make Hindus look like the white people of South Asia, because white people have never faced like systematic discrimination the way that people of color have. And this is what they're essentially trying to do with this entire thing, and then make it look like Hindus are completely privileged. Hindus could have never been through anything throughout history. Hindus are the colonial force, not the one that have been oppressed. And they strategically do this to make it justifiable to be Hinduphobic.
Okay, Rashmi, before I come to you, I think Parth wants to add to that point.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to the brilliant point Prasida made, this extends also to genocide denial, right? So these people claim that there's no link between mass violence against Hindu people and Hinduphobia. So the Bengali Hindu genocide that we're commemorating the 50th anniversary of, the Kashmiri Pandit ethnic cleansing, the 100th anniversary of the Mopla genocide again happening this year. Padmaja, you did that great interview of those Pakistani Hindu refugees. These people would say that there's no link between anti-Hindu bias and anything that they faced. So you have to think about what the actual victims must feel when these types of statements are made.
So I'm curious, Rashmi, first, can you give us your experience, and does it in any way resemble what's happening in the United States with the Dismantling Hindutva conference?
I think, yes, there is a lot of similarities. I feel like what happened with me, the whole incident, is a result of propaganda pushed through conferences like the one that's being planned right now. And it's also interesting to note that it's during the time of the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. During the 9/11 attacks, when the attacks were going on, there were so many politicians who came out giving statements about some sort of a Hindu Taliban for some reason, due to which a temple in Hamilton was burned. So all of this is happening in a way to, push propaganda, ideally to whitewash some other crimes, so that we end up taking blames for things we didn't do. And this propaganda, it's far deeper. It's just not words, or it's just not ideas, or it's just not, something in the spirit of academic freedom. It's something done very deliberately to perpetuate hatred against Hindus. And it's something I have a lived experience of.
Naisarvi, how does your experience on the West Coast with the anti-caste resolutions at universities fit into what's happening with the Dismantling Hindutva conference?
Yeah, with the anti-caste issues, there are many recurring aspects, such as the organizers that are involved. Like we mentioned, the scholars for Dismantling Hindutva conference, they have portrayed many anti-Hindu sentiments, and the organization that proposed the anti-caste discrimination resolution, which was by the name of Equality Labs, has also portrayed anti-Hindu sentiments and had publicly made statements of dismantling Hinduism, and have attacked some of our sacred festivals such as Holi. So in both cases, we should be questioning the credibility of these organizers and bringing that to light. And then another major issue that we see for the caste issue is this stereotyping of Hinduism and Hindus and not considering their lived experiences and concerns, painting the narrative on their behalf and leading them to hurting their religious sentiment and taking away their religious freedom. So the survey that Equality Labs had portrayed ascribed caste as spiritually sanctioned by Hinduism, which essentially made caste a Hindu problem. If this resolution had been passed, then it would be asking these state bodies to be defining Hinduism using this construct of caste, which is a clear violation of the right to freedom of religion.
So I'm curious, when did this acute focus on Hinduism, Hindutva in Western academia start? Do you think this is a political reaction? Did it become even more pointed, Arnav, after Mr. Modi came into power? How did this sudden, acute focus turn onto one religion?
I think it's a lot longer, and I think it's simply that Hindu American communities are starting to get the confidence to recognize and call it out more. So the awareness has been coming out over the past 10 years. But if you look at the history of South Asian studies, not even over just the 1900s moving into this century, but even before that, right? There was always an agenda behind Indology and South Asian studies in terms of evangelism, in terms of being able to understand how does Indian society or Hindu society function? What are ways that we can penetrate the society? What are ways that we can educate the society? And the problem with South Asian studies in the US, and I'm sure in pretty much any Western country, is that that's the format that South Asian studies and the colonial hangover that still exists in those departments today. So even though it's less pronounced in terms of how those scholars might present themselves, this is an issue that's existed for a long time. Now, the good news is that, again, the Hindu community over the past 20, 25 years, it's shifted from being a lot of youngsters that are coming from India that feel threatened about speaking up because if they speak up and lose their scholarships or whatever it might be, they worry about having to go back home. Now you're starting to see a lot more Americans that are born in this country or born in Canada, born in the UK, that are more comfortable speaking up because they know that it's their right, their obligation as an American to speak up and defend themselves, just as they would defend their peers of any other ethnic group, right? So as a result, on campus, you're starting to see a lot more Hindu students that are picking up their voice and shouting and saying that they won't accept this. So I do think that there is maybe some element that after, the BJP was elected in 2014, that there was an element of maybe increased politicization of the Hindu narrative. But I also think that it's largely because all of us on this call are now starting to call it out much more and much more comfortable that we aren't agents of the BJP just for doing so.
But also, is it because there is no real understanding and there aren't too many spokespersons for Hinduism in Western academia that largely what you see, or rather what is seen in those circles, is a very filtered view through people who may already be politically aligned a certain way?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it, Padmaja. And I think the other reason why you don't see more voices coming forward from within academia, just based on my personal experiences and interacting with other scholars and academics over the last 2 weeks, is that they're intimidated, right? This conference is suggesting that anybody who speaks up about Hinduphobia, anybody who disagrees with the very ridiculous claims that they're making, very ahistorical claims they're making, they label that person Hindutva, they label that person bigoted, they label that person right-wing. So as an academic and as a scholar, when there's a huge power asymmetry, when there's so many scholars on the other side at powerful elite institutions, it becomes very difficult for people, even within academia, to actually, even if they disagree, to actually speak up. So I think that's a process that we as a community need to take up more, and we need more people to actually go into these fields that study our own community. Otherwise, we're being cut out of the conversation about ourselves.
Is there a fear of being shut out? Because the largest number of scholars are aligned a certain way, so you may not get that scholarship or you may not get that placement. Is there that fear?
There definitely is. I've talked to PhD students at the top institutions here in the U.S. and they study political science, sociology, South Asian studies, etc. And what they've said is that they don't even want to make very legitimate technical methodological critiques of other people's work because they're afraid that if they do that, they'll be labeled as Hindutva. So we really have to be afraid of the culture that's being created in many of these sub-disciplines around South Asia that is completely obliterating any type of counter voice, which is exactly what's feeding into this frenzy and this, mania against Hindu people.
So give me a couple of examples, Nesargi, of something you've been told about Hinduism which has been way off the mark, but it was being presented as some kind of gospel.
I guess for me, in my experience in my undergraduate years, I guess would be like the yoga classes that I have taken. And we know how yoga has become westernized and the commodification of it. And this class, when I entered, I could clearly see that it was not aligned with my dharmic sense of what I knew yoga was. And when I brought that up to the professor, she clearly stated that when this course of yoga was being brought into academia, it was stripped of all of this religious ties and reformatted to appease the community members of other religious backgrounds, and then also to fit the secular academic setting. So this educational setting in which we are supposed to be teaching students of many diverse disciplines and perspectives of life, we have these creators of this curriculum who are deciding what is valuable and what is interesting about my culture, and then feeding it back to me and giving me this westernized version, which not only alienates me from my own culture.
Can you tell me, what was this secular yoga like?
Yeah, so you can think of of course, it's just mainly synonymous with asanas and just doing exercise and having exercise blocks and stretching. I don't know what you call them, like strips or something like that. But and then the Sanskrit names of asanas, of course, are, as you know, completely changed into their English names like downward dog. Or
so the Sanskrit name was the communal part, which was sanitized for general population's consumption.
Yes, but one thing that was interesting was that even though they're stripping this religious aspect of it, they kept some of the details here and there to make it, aesthetically pleasing or to create an ambiance. Like I was doing this Western yoga, but in the background you could hear like Hindu classical instruments as the music, or having the lyrics having Shiv, Shambhu, or Krishna in them, like the names in them. And then the students around me, of course, they have their attire of their exercise attire or their yoga mats have these own symbols on them. But I'm sure none of that is really truly aligned to Hindu Dharma or knowing self-realization or that spiritual connection.
Fascinating. So it had an Om, but I'm guessing there wasn't a swastik anywhere there.
No.
That wouldn't be as secular. Any such experiences with you, Parth?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all the time. I think one of the examples that Arnav mentioned at the beginning is actually the most relevant. So all the times, American companies, they'll commodify Hindu symbols and imagery. So he mentioned Ganesha on beer bottles, Ganesha on bath mats. There was a bag that somebody was advertising earlier this year that said Namaste, mother, and then I can't say the word on your television. So, so these are the types of misrepresentations of our tradition that happen even through, just merchandising on a lot of online platforms. And, the Padmaja, the point I would make also is that, according to Pew, only 22% of Americans know a Hindu person at a personal level. So that creates a huge amount of scope for misrepresentation and misunderstanding when what you're seeing out there in the world is this Indiana Jones Temple of Doom version of Hinduism, which is completely colonial and completely misrepresented, and you don't get it from a first-hand Hindu source.
Rashmi, what about you? Any examples where you found your culture misrepresented?
I think yes, very recently we all celebrated Raksha Bandhan, and all around social media I could see people, even celebrities from India, calling the festival patriarchal when they don't know the original roots of the festival, which is actually very matriarchal. It's actually a very feminist sort of a festival wherein the Shakti of women is celebrated. And it was quite fascinating to see people just blast their opinions and say that we shouldn't probably celebrate Raksha Bandhan or modify it in different ways to make it more relevant to present times, whereas it was relevant to present times all along.
Nesagi, the very term Hinduphobia, a lot of people who don't recognize this term say that yes, discrimination happens, it happens against minorities, it happens against people of color. To drag in religion is disingenuous. If there is a misunderstanding or discrimination, it could be based on your race, but not necessarily your religion. How do you respond to that, especially from your experiences on campus?
So, I mean, like I mentioned with the yoga example, that is clearly a aspect that is close to Hindu dharma and religion, and yet it is misrepresented or, misunderstood. So it's not to say that, when you're speaking of ethnicity or race, with that comes culture and religion as well. So, of course, there are instances of Hinduphobia on campus.
Okay, Arnav wants to respond as well.
Yeah, and I think if you look at kind of how student organizations look on campus, when you look at a Hindu group, the challenges that they face are very different than an Indian or a South Asian group. So if you look at Indian and South Asian groups, they're very popular on campus. They get lots of recruits. They have the Bollywood parties. They have the dancing. They have the food, all of those things. And nobody questions them and says, okay, are you a Modi supporter? Are you BJP? Are you Hindutva? Like, nobody goes to them with those questions. Nobody tells them, okay, you have to support our caste resolution at University of California, Davis. Like, nobody goes to the Indian group with those types of questions. But on the contrary, the Hindu group, even if all they want to do is celebrate Diwali, Holi, Ganesh Chaturthi, if they want to just celebrate their festivals and be a community for Hindu students, they are questioned by, why aren't you supporting the caste resolution that's going on our campus? Or why aren't you taking a stand for Dalits in India? Or whatever it might be, why aren't you taking a stand for minorities in South Asia? So if you look at kind of the dynamic on campus, the Indian or South Asian groups are given that pass. The Hindu group is never given that pass on campus.
Interesting. Rashmi, what about you? Have you seen any such experiences being had by your classmates or your colleagues, say if they came from Pakistan or Bangladesh, anywhere else in the subcontinent?
Well, no, I didn't see it. I don't think I saw this thing happening, but I saw a lot of it being directed at me and by people of all ethnicity, just because of my Hindu identity. And it had nothing to do with the whole Indian context of things. And I don't think it was based on race or where I came from. Rather, it was solely directed at my religion. And I think it's also because there's a safe escape after you go after someone's religion for it being Hindu is to cry Hindutva. So I think it's also easier to get away with just blatantly discriminating against people who are Hindu.
Prasiddha, how do Rutgers students feel about the administration's response to the conference that's taking place, and specifically what Audrey Trushke has said?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. As you know, that Rutgers Hindu Students Council, along with Hindu scholars, hosted the Understanding Hinduphobia conference in May 2021. And it went incredibly successfully. We had hundreds of people attend and numerous allies speak as well. And I'm very happy to be one of the authors of the resolution, the first of its kind that passed through student government that actually recognizes Hinduphobia on campus and then condemned those who were perpetuating Hinduphobia, those who denied Hinduphobia, and stood in solidarity with the students. So kind of like what Parth mentioned already, there's a huge power differential between the students and the faculty who are perpetuating the Hinduphobia itself. So as for the administration, there have been numerous talks. They have been supportive, but again, of course, there's always room for more to be done. But the first step to any community is for recognition of our pain and everything that we have been through as a community. And to be honest, Hindus are a very relatively new group. They haven't been around for as long as other minority communities in the US. So it does take a significant amount of time to even come to that point of recognition in the first place. And Hindus are just getting started. And as for how Rutgers students feel themselves, I know that a lot of Hindus, like regardless of whether they're, politically active or apolitical, it really, really doesn't matter. A lot of Hindus are on the exact same page when it comes to this issue. Even the most Hindus who may not even care about Hinduism, even people who are more like even an atheist, I would say, they know that what's going on is completely wrong. And I know that many of my friends who are non-Hindu, so I'll give you an example. Actually, when this whole thing was happening, the first people I messaged was one of my friends who is an Indian Christian, the other one is a Pakistani Muslim. And I messaged them saying, hey, this is happening, like, just when we were talking as friends. And they were extremely supportive, and they shared all of our concerns with their friend groups. And this circulated amongst a huge group of students who are not even Hindu. So I think Hindus, we also need to work harder to educate allies. And it's really important to get people who are not Hindu, not Indian, not even from the subcontinent, because obviously they're the ones who are in majority in America. We need to get them to understand what we as Hindus are going through in order to, better educate allies and stand in solidarity with other communities too.
So people in the West who have developed these ideas about India, about Hinduism, about caste, etc., what is their primary source of information? Where do they get this information from, based on which they have shaped this idea of what Hinduism is actually like, Parth?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it comes a lot from academia. And as we've already discussed, South Asian studies has a Orientalist history. That's something that's explored also in academia. Vishwa Lore and Jyoti Bakshi have a great book called The Nay Science about that. That academic work then filters in through the media, right? So you see a lot of these narratives also being spread by, national public radio, NPR in the US. They did a big piece about Audrey Trishki and the academic freedom, how her academic freedom is being threatened by Hindu groups. Washington Post, New York Times, all of these outlets, which
like what? What's
through
the narrative? What kind of narrative?
The narrative is often that there's no Hindu persecution. So, for example, Padmaja, in any discussion of Kashmir in the U.S. press that's happened over the last 2.5 years, there hasn't been a single article that has mentioned the fact that Kashmiri Pandits have been persecuted and have been ethnically cleansed from the valley. That's stunning, right? In any other region, had such an event happened, this would be clear context for including it. In coverage of the CAA, same thing. You don't see coverage of the ways in which Hindu, Sikh, Christian, Buddhist, Parsi communities in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan have been discriminated against until, ironically, right now, when the US and Canada are accepting refugees from Afghanistan who are Sikh, right? So that coverage has been biased, and it's always been used to paint Hindu persecution as Islamophobic, talking about Hindu persecution as Islamophobic, by suggesting that Hindu persecution isn't real and it's being used as a political ploy, and that's what we're really opposed to.
Did you actually try and counter any such narrative? And if yes, then what happened?
Sure. So at my own university, Princeton, there was an event that was held in August of 2019, right after Article 370 was abrogated, for example. I think that, you can have free speech, you can say whatever you want to, but at this event, basically, a lot of the speakers were very derogatory towards Kashmiri Pandits, at one point laughing at an audience member who was talking about the ethnic cleansing that he'd suffered. So I decided that I would do an event, just talking about what's actually happening in Kashmir from the perspective of a Kashmiri Pandit. So we invited Aarti Tikku, who's a journalist. I'm sure you know her. So after that event, what I realized was when I had protested the administration about the earlier event, which was derogatory to Kashmiri Pandits, one of the professors had leaked my email to one of the speakers, who then went on social media and talked about how I was an RSS frontman. Right? So once again, you see, just for speaking about the fact that Hindu persecution is being completely left out of the narrative, and how that distorts our understanding of India and what's actually happening in South Asia and what the diaspora is doing and organizing around, you see that those people are labeled as Hindutva and RSS, And the tactic is exactly to make sure that there's no opposition to this project, to this ideological project that's being played out on university campuses when it comes to South Asia and India.
So do you have RSS links? Any family history, anything? So what made all of you alive to this issue? Because largely, even in metropolitan cities in India, people are not very close to their identity, especially their religious identity. Rashmi, in America, a lot of Indians that I have met, spoken to, they sort of assimilate. Their religion doesn't matter to them as much. What made you so aware of your religious identity that you decided to speak up for it?
Well, I was raised in a very Hindu family, and we celebrate all of our festivals together, all of the cousins get together, and my parents always took out the time to explain what each of the festivals meant and what was the significance of all the rituals we followed. So I think I've always had that connect through and through, and I would credit my parents for bringing in that awareness in me. So even today when I see people spreading lies about this within colonial tropes, I know it's not true, because the people I trust the most in the world have instilled the true sense of dharma in me, which tells me what is the true meaning of all of this. So I think I have my parents to credit for that.
Finally, I want to ask each one of you, if you could answer to those who are asking for dismantling of Hindutva. As a Hindu, not in India, what would you want to tell people who want Hindutva dismantled? Let's start with you, Arnav.
So I think it starts with exactly what academics like Parth and others that are on the Understanding Hinduphobia team have been, dissecting from the Global Hindutva Conference. So number one, what are the claims that they're making, right? As long as you really go through the claims and understand what is the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference saying, then do you agree or disagree with their claims, right? Number one, they blatantly say that Hinduphobia is not real, right? All of us on this call have experienced Hinduphobia in some way. We work with students that experience Hinduphobia, even in the smallest degree, all the way to a student's, sacred thread being torn off of their body, right? So for those students or those stories to be classified as not real or not based on religious bigotry, I find serious offense with that, right? Number two is this idea that Hindu persecution is not real. So Parth gave 3 great examples earlier, but there's so many examples of Hindu persecution throughout the history of South Asia. And for us to not be able to talk about those stories is another big red flag. And then thirdly, if you want to talk about any of those issues, even if it is in the US, right, to then be silenced as some kind of front man or front person for a political party, right? I think it's just a kind of a gut check, right? A lot of Hindus are waking up to the fact that they don't feel that way about the BJP, yet they do feel the way that Hindus are persecuted or that there is Hinduphobia. It's a wake-up call for a lot of people that, okay, there is a problem with this narrative, right? So I think most well-intentioned people that hear these types of concerns will recognize that there's a problem with the narrative in this conference.
Prasiddha, has everything been lumped together? The RSS, the BJP, Hindus, Hinduism, Hindutva, and that's where this whole idea of dismantling Hindutva comes in.
Yeah, and like Arnav said, you really need to look at what exactly they're claiming. So again, they keep saying that there's a big distinction between Hinduism and Hindutva, right? And when you look at like their tweets, what they do is any Hindu who disagrees with them is somehow labeled as BJP, RSS, fascist, supremacist, Hindu supremacist. But I just don't really understand this, because any group is allowed to talk about basic rights for their community, and trying to silence anyone, even if the criticism is like completely genuine, not rude, completely polite, it is somehow taken off as like some kind of extremist ideology, and they're the ones.
Also, is it seen as anti-other groups? Like if you talk about Hinduism, you will be seen as anti-Muslim and also anti-Dalit.
Yeah, no, definitely. And they're using, and let's be very clear, like anti-Muslim sentiments definitely do exist in the US. but like you can't use this as a cover to basically silence Hindu voices. That's completely not okay. It's like saying just because one kind of hatred exists, the other kind of hatred like doesn't exist. But why can't they all? Like they all exist in different forms, of course, and we can offer support to anyone who has faced hatred or bigotry. But trying to silence Hindus and just saying that, oh, you are XYZ because you speak out for basic rights, that's what's not okay.
Do you find any support, final word, Parth, do you find support from within academia when you try and make yourself heard?
I think there's a growing, recognition from people that this is something that is happening. I think one of the communities, two of the communities actually that have been very supportive towards Hindus in recent times have been the Armenian community, which also experienced a genocide at the hands of Turks in 1917, and also the Jewish community, which is much larger in the U.S. I think from within academia, there is a growing recognition that many of the claims that these people make are very ahistorical. The claim about genocide denial, I think in particular, has gotten people to really look at and understand, the fact that this conference doesn't represent academic freedom. It represents a power grab that's intended to make sure that anybody who disagrees, especially Hindu people, aren't able to organize and have their voices heard.
Prasiddha, do you think that there could be a backlash against you and other Hindu students because of the conference? Why are you apprehensive about this conference? What makes you apprehensive?
Yeah, no, definitely. And basically any Hindu student that speaks out definitely does have, honestly, including myself, have had fears of, oh no, what's going to happen to me? And I know this because, for example, faculty have attempted to endanger my family. There have been numerous incidences where people have received threatening messages. So many more things that have gone
like
on
what?
similar to this. Well, there was one incident where a Hindu student spoke up about the Kashmiri Pandits on campus, and they actually received a message saying that I can't wait for white supremacists to shoot you up. And like, this isn't even me changing any words. And they're literally threatened with violence. So a lot of people feel afraid to even speak out.
Have you gotten any threats of violence, Nesargi?
I have personally not gotten any threats of violence because I just not have been exposed or been in the front lines talking about situations like this. But seeing that happening to my fellow students at Hindu Students Council is definitely something that I take personally.
Okay, thanks very much. It's been amazing talking to you all. There's always room for debate and discussion. No one should be silenced, no one voice, no one community should be silenced and lumped together with a certain ideology, or rather what people presume is the ideology of that entire group. When we talk about debate and academic freedom, it should cut both ways. Let's hope that happens, and thanks very much for speaking up. Arnav, Rashmi, Parth, Nesargi and Prasiddha. Pleasure speaking to you all.